Who is Peg O'Nell? Does she really demand a sacrifice every 7 years? And what forgotten truths lurk beneath the surface of her legend? Hi everybody, I'm Nick and this is Beasts of the Old World, a channel that explores ancient folklore and mythical creatures from across the globe. Today we're looking at an old Lancashire legend from the Ribble Valley, the tragic tale of Peg O'Nell. At the edge of the River Ribble, near Waddow Hall, there's a place where the water has a grim reputation. Here, if local legend is to be believed, something stirs beneath the surface, waiting. Peg O'Nell is not a name spoken lightly in these parts. The people of Clitheroe have whispered stories of her in one version or another, around the fireplaces of their homes at night, for centuries. Stories of cruelty, and of a curse that has never quite faded. The most well-known version of the tale is found in William Henderson's Notes on the Folklore of the Northern Counties, and begins at Waddow Hall, a grand and imposing manor. Peggy was a servant there, a girl of no importance in the eyes of her masters. The hall belonged to the Starkey family, and, as the story goes, Peg was given the worst jobs, blamed for every misfortune, and treated with casual cruelty, as was the fate of many in service. It may be no surprise to you then that Peg often found herself at odds with her mistress. One night in the depths of winter, things took a very dark turn indeed. It was late, the air sharp with frost, and Peggy had once again somehow incurred the wrath of Mistress Starkey. What she did to bring about her mistress's foul mood is not known, though perhaps she'd objected to being sent out so late in the dark to fetch the water from the well, for the night was bitterly cold and the path slick with ice. What is known is that when Peg was sent down to the well to fetch water, her mistress, full of scorn, is said to have sneered at her, "I hope you break your neck." Peggy went out to fetch the water, but did not return. For when she left the house, Mistress Starkey's malediction was fulfilled. Peggy slipped upon the ice and fell, and broke her neck. A dark end to a morbid tale, and yet this was only the beginning. Soon after Peg's passing, Waddow Hall fell into a cycle of misfortune. Crops failed, livestock sickened, people fell ill for no discernible reason. Whatever happened, there was only ever one culprit. "It's Peg," they said. "It's Peg's curse." John Harland and Thomas Wilkinson report in Lancashire folklore that
on one occasion Master Starkey, so the host was named, returned home very late with a broken leg. He'd been hunting that day and, report said, had made too free with the ale afterwards. But, as usual, Peggy bore the blame. For some dissatisfaction she had waylaid the master of the house and caused his horse to fall.
Many such misfortunes took place in the months and years since her passing. Chickens were stolen, cows died, the sheep strayed and could not be found, and soon even the children of the house fell sick under Peggy's curse. It was also held that Mistress Starkey's 10-year-old son was possessed by a demon, which, again, was suspected to be Peggy. And so a preacher was sent for, with a view to exorcising the evil spirit that tormented the boy. Long after the preacher was due to arrive, as the night set in and the storms around the manor intensified, Mistress Starkey grew concerned that the preacher had himself met with some misfortune. Standing outside upon her porch, she heard a dismal cry upon the air. Sure enough, in attempting to cross the river by the stepping stones nearby, the preacher had fallen in, and was only rescued when 2 trusty servants of the house, sent to seek out the owner of the crying voice, found him and bore him to safety. Of course, this was Peg's work too. It was also the final straw for Mistress Starkey. Driven to desperation, she took matters into her own hands. Near the well where Peg had last been sent, there stood an ancient statue of a woman, her stone robes flowing, her face set in solemn silence. In a fit of fury, the mistress of Waddow Hall flew out into the storm, raised an axe, and struck the statue's head from its shoulders in a single blow. If Mistress Starkey thought she'd put an end to the legend of Peg and Nell with the beheading of the old statue, she was badly mistaken. For by the time the 19th century rolled around, Peg and Nell's influence had stretched far beyond the bounds of Waddow Hall. She was now proving to be a menace to all who tried to cross the nearby River Ribble. Worse still, it was no longer just misfortune that Peg was blamed for. It was death. Somehow, it seems, the ghost of Peg and Nell had transformed from being a nuisance to the family of the woman who cursed her to being an insatiable, vengeful ghoul, demanding a life be taken at least once every 7 years.
She was inexorable in demanding every 7 years a life to be quenched in the waters of the Ribble. When Peg's night, the closing night of the period, came round, unless a bird or cat or a dog was drowned in the stream, some human being was certain to fall victim there.
Somehow, a downtrodden servant girl of Waddow Hall, who'd been blamed for everything wrong at the hall when she worked there, and was then blamed again for every misfortune that befell the family who occupied the hall in the years after her death, was now being blamed for every single person drowned in the river for hundreds of years afterwards. To illustrate this, Henderson also reports that one evening a young man stopped at an inn by the Ribble whilst riding from Waddington to Clitheroe on business. There was as yet no bridge that could convey him across the river at Brungerley, and he was strongly urged that the river was too swollen and dangerous to ford it at the stepping stones. Alas, the young man did not heed this advice, insisting that his business was urgent and that he must go on. The innkeeper tried very hard to get him to wait until the river calmed, but to no avail, and when the maid added that it was Peg and Nell's night, and that she'd not yet had her life, the young man laughed and set off. But neither horse nor rider reached the opposite bank. Even in relatively recent history, bodies have been pulled from the Ribble's dark waters, drowned near Brungerley Bridge, the place where the stepping stones were once the only way to cross the river, a place where it's said, Peg waits. In 1908, a teenager named Joseph Fell vanished beneath the waters after jumping into the river at a spot known locally as Dangerous Corner. This was enough for the dark legend to resurface. 7 years earlier, another child had drowned in the Ribble in similar circumstances. "It's Peg," they said. "Come for her due." Yet, as chilling as this tale may be, there's something about it that doesn't quite fit. Not only do the many deaths in the Ribble over the years almost always fail to tally up with a neat 7-year cycle, this notion of a recurring blood sacrifice seems to have been added at a much later date. We first hear of the legend of Peg of the Well in 1844, when Cyrus Redding wrote about his visit to Waddow Hall, and, when asking about Peggy of the Well, was shown the statue and its separated head, and was invited to see the small room in the attic where Peggy was said to have stayed while she worked at the hall. Nothing of a 7-year curse is mentioned by the servants of the house, or recorded in Redding's work. We first hear about Peg and Nell's 7-year curse in 1877, when William Dobson records it in his Rambles by the Ribble. Then the curse is associated with her again in Henderson's Notes on the Folklore of the Northern Counties, published in 1879. So where did this strange aspect of the myth come from? In the mid-19th century, John Harland and Thomas Turner Wilkinson, historians documenting the traditions of Lancashire, also wrote about the legend of Peg and Nell, details of which can be found between pages 170 and 172 of Lancashire folklore. These accounts discuss in detail the immediate troubles of the Starkey family following Peg's death, but no 7-year curse is mentioned at all. But on page 90 of the same text, we read this.
The stepping stones at Brungley, near Clitheroe, are said to be haunted by a malevolent sprite, who assumes almost as many shapes as Proteus of old. He is not known by any particular designation, nor are there any traditions to account for his first appearance, but at least one life in every 7 years is required to appease the anger of the spirit of the Ribble at this place.
You may remember these stepping stones from 2 of the accounts already discussed in this video. This is where the preacher was said to have fallen in the river on his way to perform an exorcism of Mistress Starkey's youngest son, and was also where the young businessman, despite warnings of Peg's insatiable appetite for death by drowning, attempted his own doomed crossing of the swollen Ribble. So it seems the 7-year curse was a pre-existing tradition attributed to a malevolent water sprite without a name. So how did this tradition become associated with Peg and Nell? This is a pattern seen time and time again in folklore. Old, vague fears get absorbed into newer, more tangible stories. If the people of Clitheroe already feared something lurking in the Ribble, something that claimed lives at fixed intervals, then it would have been all too easy to attach that fear to a local spook story with a growing reputation. And once the connection had been made, it could not be undone. By 1877, when William Dobson published Rambles by the Ribble, the 7-year curse had become a fully formed part of Peg's legend. She was no longer just a ghost, she was a force of nature, and whether or not she'd ever truly been connected to the river in this way, her name was now inseparable from it. But if Peg and Nell was never the original cause of the 7-year sacrifice, then where does this specific number come from in the first place? The answer may lie in something far older than Peg herself. The idea that rivers are living, hungry things is far older than the story of Peg and Nell. Throughout English folklore, water is rarely just water. It's unpredictable, cunning, and often cruel. And when people drown in it, the water itself is often to blame. The Ribble is far from the only river to have its own spirit demanding its due. In Yorkshire, the River Tees is home to Peg Powler, a green-skinned hag who lurks beneath the surface. Parents once warned their children not to go too near the edge, lest Peg Powler pull them under with her long, bony fingers. In Lancashire, there is Jenny Greenteeth, another nightmarish creature, lurking in the reeds beneath the surface. Jenny may be said to haunt every pool, river and pond you could point at, reaching up to snatch those who wander too close. My own grandfather used to warn me about Jimmy Greenteeth, whom I suspect was another local variant of the same myth from East Lancashire. These water hags all fall under the bracket of the Grindylow, and the local mythology surrounding each is so rich that we'll cover each of them in their own separate episode at a later date. For now, it's enough to mention them only to illustrate how in each of these stories, water is not just dangerous, it is deliberately, hungrily malevolent. It chooses to strike. It takes who it wants. If you get into that situation, there will be nothing you can do about it, which, let's be honest, is sort of true. The idea that a life must be claimed every 7 years is not unique to Peg and Nell or to the Ribble or even just to water spirits. In the legend of the Lambton Worm, for example, a monstrous serpent terrorises a village for 7 years. In some versions of Black Dog myths, it's said that the spectral hound will only appear once every 7 years, heralding a coming death. Beyond these specific examples, pacts with the Fae, and even with the devil himself, often seem to follow this 7-year cycle too. It's a number that seems to hold deep significance in English folklore. The main reason for this is the number 7's significance in Christianity. While its significance may predate the Christian tradition in Europe, it's also been absorbed by it. The earth was created in 7 days, there are 7 deadly sins, and the apocalypse is tied to 7 seals, trumpets and bowls, etc., to name just a few examples. And in some of the oldest stories of England's rivers, sacrifices, usually of animals, were made to the water, not to a ghost, not to a mythical creature, to something older, something long forgotten. And it is here that we find Belisama. Her name is all but forgotten, buried in the footnotes of history. Belisama was an ancient Celtic goddess believed to have been worshipped in Gaul, particularly in connection with rivers, light and fire. Though little direct evidence survives, her name and associations suggest she was a significant deity, possibly an equivalent of the Roman goddess Minerva. Curiously, it appears that the River Ribble was once known by a different name. The Roman geographer Ptolemy called this river Belisama. Celtic cultures often venerated rivers as deities or sacred entities, and the water was seen as both life-giving and dangerous, requiring offerings to ensure prosperity and prevent disaster. If the Ribble was once called Belisama, it could suggest an ancient belief in a goddess inhabiting its waters. If the Ribble was indeed once associated with her, there may have been local cults that honoured her through offerings. The Peggy legend, with its 7-year sacrificial rituals, may preserve a memory of these lost traditions. But the people who once worshipped Belisama are long gone. Their prayers have faded and their offerings buried under centuries of earth, lost in the ever-flowing current of time. And yet, something remains. Peggy story is easy to explain in parts. A servant girl mistreated, dead before her time. A haunting, a curse, a legend passed down through generations. But stories are like rivers, they change course, carving new paths, absorbing new waters. And when we follow Peg's story to its source, the ground beneath it becomes unstable. Because Peggy, as she exists today, is the last echo of something ancient. A river goddess is not a ghost. She does not need a name, or a face, or a tragic tale of injustice. She doesn't haunt a single place. She is the water. She is the place itself, and for centuries the people who lived along her banks feared her, respected her, and paid their dues. In time, they forgot her name, but the river doesn't forget. And when people drowned in its waters, when the cycle of death could not be explained, an old story was given a new face. The ancient goddess may have faded, replaced perhaps by a water sprite who demanded a sacrifice every 7 years. This unnamed sprite faded too, replaced in time by Peggy. The names change, but the river stays hungry. The River Ribble is quiet at night. The water gurgles, thick and dark, reflecting the pale moonlight as it winds past Waddow Hall. The air hums with the faint, whispering rustle of leaves in the trees, the occasional cry of an unseen bird. And if you stand there, alone on the riverbank, staring into the blackness of the water, you might just feel it. That creeping sensation, the hairs standing on end on the back of your neck. And if you do, listen to your gut. Do not try to cross the river. Not on Peg's night.